Hello, I'm Albert Yip. This presentation is part of the Big History Invention series. It is about weapon. We know from our closest relative that chimpanzees will also use weapons using rocks or wooden sticks. For them, the weapons is mostly for intimidation purpose. The oldest artifact that we have discovered are 8 wooden throwing spears, dating back to 300,000 years ago. So that will be the weapon used before Homo sapiens days ourselves appear on Earth. So that probably will be used by Homo erectus. For weapons, we typically distinguish between the cold weapons and the hot weapons. The cold weapons refer to weapons which do not involve any energy. The delivery of the weapon basically depends on the person using the weapon, whereas the hot weapons refer to weapons which contains explosives. For the cold weapons, there are two types. One is for hand-to-hand close combat. The other is ranged weapons which can deliver harms at a distance. We must remind ourselves that weapons can be used not only against human beings. Weapons is also used against other animals. The earliest probably will be the spears that has shown before. The other will be a stone axe. In this case, axe which will be used in, for example, in hunting. Stone spears also appear in our history as well. For almost every culture, there's always bow and arrow. It seems to be quite a common invention. Every culture either invented it or copied it from some other culture. Bows and arrows have determined quite a number of evolution of the human history, have changed the course of history by using more superior bow or arrows. The energy of bow and arrows is stored in the bow itself. As the shooter pull on the bow, the energy is stored. When he releases, the energy is transferred to the arrow. So the aim of the game is to have a strong bow, of course limited by the strength the shooter have, and then as well as the accuracy of the arrow. Another way of delivering objects towards the enemy is by slingshots. It can be as simple as a piece of string holding a stone, or in this case, top left-hand corner, we see a Roman style of a slingshot where there's a stake and then the arrow is held between the hook. As you swing it, because of the extended length, the launching velocity is higher. Of course, not only arrows can be thrown at the enemy, there's other objects to be thrown as well. So there are different types of stars. In terms of the modern slingshot, I think this is the modern conception, because I don't know is there any really elastic material have been used in the past. So modern slingshot is probably very modern. In order to improve the accuracy of shooting an arrow, crossbows are invented. The first crossbow is actually invented in China. The conception here on the upper part is a compartment where arrows are placed there. As the racket read back, the bow is draw. At the same time, one arrow will be loaded into the crossbow. So when it is loaded, the shooter no longer have to exert physical strength to hold the bow in tension. That means it will have more capability of shooting it with more accuracy. To increase the strength, the Romans used rackets. So one or two men will be pulling a very strong bow using mechanical advantage like rackets, or using the whole body weight to pull a very strong bow. And in order to store that, it has to be have a release mechanism, and the energy is stored until release, and there's no more need to exert a strength to do it. Instead of increasing the strength of the arrow, another way to do it is to make the arrow poisonous. So again, poisons have been used almost in every culture. When poison is used, then the effectiveness of the weapon does not depend on the energy delivered by the weapon itself, is by the poison. So smaller energies needed to send the darts or arrows forward. So including blowpipes can be used to shoot poisonous darts or arrows towards the enemy or animal. For many types of weapons, obviously knives and swords. In this presentation, I'm more focused on the ranged weapons. But as a side note, for any person in China supposedly to be a martial arts master will have to master at least these 18 different types of weapons. So let's go to the modern weapons. The simplest one, or the most common ranged weapons, probably is the hand grenade, which is thrown towards the enemy, and the grenade itself will have a timed fuse. So after a certain time, the fuse starts, and then the grenade will explode, and it is the explosion which will kill or harm the enemy. The other type is changing the bow and arrow into a gunpowder powered bullet. So instead of an arrow, it becomes a projectile. Initially it was just a sphere, and later on bullets have their shape changed to improve the aerodynamic efficiency. Anyway, the energy that is used is the explosive at the end of the bullet. When the hammer strikes the bullet, then the projectile is sent out with the explosion using the gunpowder stored in the bullet. For accuracy as well as for distance, we need a longer barrel for the bullet to travel in order to confine the bullet's direction. Modern day sniper rifles can kill at over 1 kilometer distance, so they are pretty powerful weapons. Instead of just improving in accuracy, another modern innovation is increase in the number of bullets that is sent per unit of time. So that will be the machine guns. For really long distance, rifles or bullets will not deliver the kind of damage. So in order for large damage to be done, the projectile has to be pretty heavy. And because of that, we need quite a bit of explosive to send it to a distance. So that will belong to the class of cannons. Sending projectile to kill the enemy let us think about what about protecting ourselves from projectiles. So tanks are invented. Usually this kind of tanks both acts as a personnel carrier as well as a weapon delivery platform where projectiles can be shot out either using the cannon on the top of the tanks or on the machine guns at the top, again near the top of the tank. This is a look of a modern tank. The projectile itself so far will not throw by itself because in the projectile there's no propellant. So a variation of that is making the projectile itself with a propellant. So that will be missiles. Missiles can be classified into two types. One is the offensive one. That means you are trying to send a projectile to the enemy territory, and with that you will have a certain kind of warhead. The delivery of the warhead itself will create a damage. So missiles basically is just a delivery vehicle. Because of the existence of missiles, we also have the existence of anti-missiles. Anti-missile meaning a missile used to intercept an enemy's missile in order to destroy it before its warhead lands on a important region or area. The concept basically is when we have early detection, we know that somebody has sent out a missile, an enemy missile has been launched. Then the detection mechanism will detect it, and then from that point onward, we'll do a ballistic ballistic projectile path calculation, and then send off another smaller, usually smaller but faster missile to intercept the incoming hostile missile. In terms of delivery, there are two methods of delivery. One is the intercontinental or the ballistic missile methods, where an intercontinental ballistic missile will be sent very high almost into the space, and then will come down quickly. So on the upward flight, that part usually will be powered flight with a propellant. Then at its descent, then you usually will have some kind of minor propellant to modify its path. The other way of sending the missile is by using cruise missile. Basically, cruise missile will be try to send it not using speed, but using stealth. That means it try to avoid being detected by flying very low, close to the land surface or sea surface, and then before it attack, you probably will climb up a little bit and then will do the attack. So far in the history of mankind, we know killing of innocent civilians is always part of a war. Even Bible contains verses which God commanded the Jews to kill indiscriminately innocent civilians. This kind of killing is done by the projectiles themselves, as well as by mines and bombs. For mines, they serve the purpose of creating a barrier so that advancing troops will stand on the mines and the mines explode, and hence will stop the troops advancing. So that becomes a barrier. The same thing happens to sea as well. So we have the land mines as well as sea mines. The problem is that when you lay the mines, you place the mines in some some area which you think your enemy will advance, but you also want to hide it so that your enemy will not be able to detect the mines in order to be effective. But as you left the war zone, nobody is coming back to pick up these mines. So this mine becomes a indiscriminating killing mines for civilian. So the world have decided that mines should be banned. So a couple of countries ago, we have the world tried to have an international agreement to ban landmines. Unfortunately, looking at this particular map, the pink region are countries which haven't signed this international agreement. That means there's still quite a bit of powerful countries with quite a bit of military abilities not signing this anti-mine international treaty. Just like using poisons in darts and arrows, other weapons have been developed, including chemical weapons. Typically, chemical weapons will indiscriminately damage the whole environment as well as population. During the Vietnam War, U.S. Army used quite a bit of the Agent Orange, and the effect of this is quite a number of Vietnamese children are disfigured when they are born. Again, international agreements has reached to ban chemical weapons, and those red regions are those countries which haven't signed the ban of chemical weapons. In the last century, the world see the development of nuclear weapon. Nuclear weapon is a very powerful device using energy of the nuclear. The number of nuclear weapon tests done in the world is summarized in this particular graph, starting from the 1945 to about 1996. The blue represent the test done by USA. The red represent the test done by the then Soviet Union. Looking at this, the majority of tests is done by US. Instead, another type of weapon is the biological weapon, using germs or virus to infect a population.
The idea of using disease as a weapon gained a new level of sophistication in the early 1930s as nationally funded research programs on biological warfare were developed. The Japanese had a very active offensive biowarfare research program which included a battalion known as Unit 731. In their program, the Japanese conducted experiments on humans using 15 to 20 different disease-causing agents, with anthrax being one of their favorites. Allied prisoners of war and innocent Manchurian civilians in nearby villages provided an almost endless supply of experimental subjects. When word of Unit 731 leaked to the West, Allied forces began their own programs, concerned that Japan and possibly Germany would gain a military advantage in biowarfare research.
Again, the world have tried to ban biological weapons, and this is the map showing the countries which have signed the agreement. The red are those which haven't signed, participate in this international agreement to ban biological weapons. Weapon delivery. Modern wars is a fight by deliver weapons to distance. So weapon delivery becomes one of the main weapons developed in the recent years, including the missiles. But here are some more traditional delivery mechanisms. The first one is obviously submarines. The original purpose of submarines as used in the Second World War by the Germans is to interrupt the sea transportation of material to mostly England. So the German U-boats will try to sink all the merchant ships, especially those carrying weapons or a lot of resources for England. Today, submarines are used to deliver missiles. This is the missile silos for delivering cruise missiles. On the sea, there are other mechanisms of projecting your force. Well, obviously, destroyer is a big ship which has been the major naval capability, but recently is more used for protection of merchant ships. To really exert your political military power, you will need a delivery platform which can carry aircrafts, and the aircrafts basically will be the fighter aircrafts as well as its supports. So aircraft carrier is a measure of the ability to exert your military strength at a distance. Since the First World War, people discovered that airplane can be used in different roles in a war. Initially, as a surveillance device, a spying device, looking at the how the enemy is at the other side of the fence. But additionally, we found that aircraft can also deliver weapons, and it becomes a delivery platforms. So some of the aircraft now divide into two types. One is a bombers, which basically deliver weapons, but these bombers need protection, and therefore we have the fighter aircrafts, which will fly to protect the bombers. And these fighter aircrafts usually will be equipped with air-to-air missiles. So the older bombers have to depend on fighter aircraft to protect it. But later on, we find that if your enemy can't see you coming, then you can bomb. So stealth becomes another direction of development for bombers. Recent developments is by drones, the unmanned air vehicles. There's no personnel on the drones, and hence the protection of these drones becomes less important. And some of these drones can fly really long distance, so we have the ability of sending missiles or doing surveillance. Someone have done a calculation or estimates of the worst wars or atrocities since 500 BC to today. And this is the graph showing 100 of these worst wars and atrocities. From a first glance, it seems that the number of wars in recent decades around the right-hand side of the graph is much more. There's much more wars happened in recent decades. But as a first glance, it seems that the number of deaths is lowering, but that is a wrong interpretation. We must note that the vertical axis is deaths per 100,000 people. We know that our human population increased from about 1 billion to 8 billion in the last 200 years. So that means the number of people increased by at least 8 times. So keeping the same rate of deaths, that means that will be 8 times the number of deaths. So looking at this graph again, we can quite safely conclude that the last few hundred years has been the most bloody in all our human history. So having weapons is bad in a sense, but what happens if you don't have weapons or if you can't defend yourself? Well, the history isn't very good as well. Here is just an example, and this example is taken from Australia. So this is an Australia example. Someone again have done a estimates that since 1870s, when the white people arrived in Australia, different part of Australia's Aborigines suffer a tremendous amount of killing. The estimate is in the Northern Territories up to 25 to 1. 25 Aboriginal people were killed per white settlement. The estimates for Queensland, just Queensland, between 1820 to and early 1900 is 65,000 Aborigines has been killed as a result of white settlement. Well, why? Because these Aborigines do not have the military or weapon technology to protect themselves. The same happened in the 19th and 20th century to China. At that time, China probably is still the largest economic country in the world with a GDP probably bigger than Europe. One of the war between China and Japan is a fight about 120 years ago. In that war, although China has a much larger GDP than Japan, China lost, and hence Taiwan and the today Diaoyu Islands is now belongs to Japan. At the same time, the compensation of war paid by the Chinese to Japan is 5 times the then Japanese GDP. So having large GDP doesn't imply you have a strong army or military to protect yourself. That's not only true in yesteryears. Even today, just a couple of months ago, we see Gaza being destroyed by the Jews, the Israel. Basically, the people in Gaza have no army, no air force, no bunkers to hide, and they are being bombarded by a military with lots of military might supported by US, using US military equipment, and the damage, the human suffering is unmentionable. So this has been a warning. Actually, in 1961, the US President Eisenhower famously at his last address to the Congress have said these words: "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence whether so or unso, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. Unfortunately, it seems his warning hasn't been heard. So, how does the world look today? Let's look at the country with the largest military expenditure. This is a graph showing the expenditure. Since the 1950s, the US military expenditure has always been in the region of around $500 billion, well, in a constant 2013 dollar, on around that range. Worldwide, the US military spending represents from about 33% in the 1990s to about 43% of the total spending the world spent in military. So we now have a country which is spending more in military than everything else. Let's assume the military-industrial complex is willing to spend 1% of their income, the government funds that is given to them, as a public relationship to try to influence the political process. So again, we assume that in 2013, the US government is spending $514 billion. In US, we know that we have 535, so let's say 540 congressmen. So that means on average, the military-industrial complex can spend $10 million per congressman per year to influence their political voting. With that in mind, that means there is a very powerful force behind the use of weapons. If we want to stop wars, then we must agree that every citizen of every country must have the courage to send his or her own warmongering leaders to international war crime courts. Until then, peace will not come. Thank you, and I hope I will see you next time in another presentation. Bye-bye.